Welcome everybody to the 2015 VictorOps State of On-Call report. It's December, so you know what that means. The mimosas are out and we're going to talk about on-call. It's going to be a lot of fun. With me today, I have Tara Callahan, who conducted the survey tirelessly to collect over 600 individual replies and categorize them into this great report. And I have Joni Klippert, our VP of Product, with us today too, to also do some comments on this report. Thank everybody for joining, and we'll just get right into it. All right. For those of you who don't want to stay around for the mimosas, we have a summary of the data here. Alert fatigue is still getting worse, and it's not surprising. It's a tough job to do, and and anecdotally, we see this all the time with our organizations that we talk to all the time and sell to, right? It's as infrastructures get more and more complicated and more monitoring systems are tied in, alert fatigue and noise in the system gets to be a big deal. 70% responding that the issue is in their organization, up from 60% last year. So noise is a thing. You'll see that in the industry going forward. 52% report that on-call is only sort of getting better, but that's down from 60% last year. So there is some positive movement in this area. Adoption of automated tools continues to grow. That's not surprising. As infrastructures get more complicated, the tools to deal with that have to become more robust as well. Similar to last year, email is still the #1 way that people find out about problems. That is unfortunate, because it's probably also the worst way to learn about problems. We'll talk a little bit about that later. The use of status page technology to communicate to a wider contingent of people during a firefight is starting to grow. Also, I would say the transparency of organizations to communicate that they have technical problems is becoming more of a thing. And not surprising, ChatOps is gaining in popularity, with reported use up 40% from 28% last year. That's not surprising. As infrastructures get more complicated, you need more tools, you need more eyeballs on it, and more automation is definitely a good thing. Just some quick overview of sort of what we've seen in the industry that isn't captured easily within metrics, but it's definitely things we see every day when we talk to people. It sort of goes into this idea of motivation of why we have done this survey for 2 years now. So, 2 years ago when we started collecting data for the first State of On-Call report, we were motivated by the trends started by agile software development, and the resulting pressure continuous deployment was putting on technical operations teams in companies of all sizes. Innovate your software or become irrelevant in the world of software as service. Little did we know at the time it was a narrative of operations work becoming more difficult and the beginning of the extinction of operations as a whole. What used to be people bolting boxes into racks is now engineers writing code. What used to be uptime via no change has become uptime by constant change. The clear signal over the last year has been the death of operations as the lone protectors of highly technical infrastructures and systems. More and more organizations are placing developers on the front line of rapid response and resolution of technical problems. Alerting someone to a problem is no longer acceptable, and we are seeing this in many companies as they dismantle or at least augment their network operations centers, or NOCs, in favor of routing specific system problems to the engineers that built that part of the system having issues. With that, let's get into some of the data. Tara, why don't you tell us who took the survey?
Thanks, Tom. Happy to. So, pretty consistent with last year, the majority of the industries that we saw were represented, as we like to classify them, internet-forward companies. So that means companies that are relying on their website for commerce, companies that are running apps that have a lot of people using them, internet services, definitely media and entertainment. So that was pretty consistent with the responses that we got last year. Additionally, the people who answered the survey were the ones who are on-call or managing on-call teams. Some of the roles included operations, system admins, developers, IT, and other programmers. Additionally, on this slide, you can see the variance of the company size, with most of our respondents being in the 100 employees and more category.
That was consistent with last year, wasn't it?
Yes, that is true. I think, yeah, in terms of actually all of that, we kind of, I think we tried to promote the survey to the same kind of audience, a lot of DevOps-heavy audiences and people who are in the space.
Right, and most of these responses were collected through our partners, correct? DevOps.com, O'Reilly, StatusPage.io, Linux Journal, DevOps Weekly, and New Relic.
That is correct.
And as a whole, don't represent our customers in any degree greater than would normally occur.
Yes, that is correct.
Awesome. Infrastructure and automation. Joni, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely with the trend in infrastructure as code, essentially. We're moving more and more to cloud infrastructure. So we had an 11% increase from last year in terms of people using cloud or metal and cloud. And as you can imagine, along with sort of automation as part of DevOps, we're seeing tools like Puppet and Chef continue to really take off, with 70% of respondents reporting regular use of these tools, which was up from about 58% last year.
So that's 12% in 1 year. That's pretty impressive. Also, it's kind of interesting if you check the metal numbers. These numbers correlate pretty closely with some of the conclusions in the 2015 Right Scale State of the Cloud survey, where respondents stated that 55% of enterprises reported that a significant portion of their existing applications are not in the cloud, but were built with cloud-friendly architectures. DevOps is maturing. The majority of respondents consider themselves at least minimally knowledgeable of DevOps, with 76% reporting this year or more a year or more DevOps experience, up from 52% last year. This number also correlates strongly with other industry data points. So in case you're wondering, DevOps is a real thing out there, and we see it more and more every day. The most important or popular DevOps practices cited by people in order of importance were automation and culture. I think the culture thing is very interesting because it does separate the people who are sort of the leading thought leaders in this space from what I would call traditional operations teams, and that melding of development and operations is a super important thing. This reaffirms also data we see internally at VictorOps, where DevOps change agents tend to be the people that engage with us for our solution.
All right, so if any of you are familiar with VictorOps, you see that one of our common taglines is that being on-call sucks, right? This is a very emotional job. It's a difficult job. It's a reactionary and interrupt-driven job. And every time we issue the survey, we make sure to understand, what are the pain points that people are still encountering? Does it feel like it's getting better with on-call and sort of the changes in bringing more types of roles into on-call rotations, or is it getting worse? And we ask them what's really great about the job and what they struggle with. So what was great to see in this survey is that 80% of the respondents said that problems associated with being on call in general are getting better, right? Like, it's not quite as difficult for some reason or another than it used to be. But we really dug into the four main pain points of being on call. And this first one is something that we're very, very passionate about working to solve for, which is alert fatigue. So not only are there a lot of alarms being generated by your system, but there are a lot of false alarms being generated. And engineers are still looking for tools to help them quiet that noise and ensure that when that page goes off, it's really something that they can actually take action on and solve for. The next issue is not knowing what's happening across all of the systems when they get paged. So not having enough situational awareness or eyes into all of the different components that may be failing that lead them to the notion of what is actually happening so that they can begin their work. The idea that leaders in an organization don't have context around what's happening during a firefight. So as you can imagine, as an on-call person, this is a very frustrating thing where your hair's on fire, you're trying to figure out, what it is that you need to solve for, and you've got, the VP of choice knocking down your door asking, what it is, when it's going to be resolved. And so there's a need for better tooling to help inform internal constituents of your progress as you're working on a firefight. And then not having relevant information to solve the problem. So when you get alerted to something, there's this next step of needing to know, where is my run book? Where's the graph I need to help me discern if this is the severity of this issue? And there appears to still be a gap there in getting the information you need to solve problems. But feel free to read the quotes that are on the slides, but the best part of being on call, as difficult as it can be, people take a lot of pride in this job. And keeping systems up and running is the lifeblood of an organization. So having a lot of new challenges for very inquisitive folks, this is something that they love. Being able to solve that problem in the heat of the moment. And scotch, apparently.
I think if I was to riff on this a little bit, I would say if it's starting to get better, I think it probably has a lot to do, again, with this notion of DevOps as a thing. The people that we run into that sort of, take on, if they would self-describe themselves as DevOps people, they tend to be of a different mindset. They're investigators of problems. They're interested in how the system is misbehaving. They want to dig deeper. They want more data versus what can be a personality type that has historically been kind of a pure operations role, which can be a little more anxious, right? They don't understand all parts of the system, so that makes them anxious about this. So I think this whole spotlight on DevOps and the discussion sort of around being on call, the discussion about spreading that to a wider audience within the company because of the complexity of the system, if anything, I think it's starting to take the pain off, and I think we'll see that in the future.
I just want to say very quickly, along with the anecdotal quotes on the side, the fifth one down is really interesting because this person is leveraging the insights gained from the on-call rotations as the primary catalyst and feedback loop to drive improvement in our DevOps capabilities. So I think the people that are really kind of living up to the challenge of the on-call process are the ones who are learning from it and who are using it as a means of improvement.
That's good, yeah. Keep talking about managing on-call, the next slide.
Yeah, definitely. So we asked the survey respondents how many people make up their on-call team and how long the on-call rotation lasts. As you can see here, the majority, 54%, said they have between 2 to 5 people that make up each on-call team and that they're on call for a week at a time. This is pretty consistent with what we've seen, both internally and with our customers. The thing that we thought was really interesting was when we asked who is on call, what types of roles within the company are on call. So, as you would expect, operations, IT, developers, but additionally we're seeing support, we're seeing DevOps, and just the fact that developers are on the list right now, it definitely supports a trend that we're seeing that Todd has already mentioned, and that is getting more people involved in the on-call process.
I think it will also be interesting to look at over time as, quote, DevOps continues to grow and you do have different types of roles having on-call responsibilities. What that does to the nature of the on-call rotation, having sort of just a one-week rotation across all of these people is a completely arbitrary amount of time. It doesn't really relate to sort of their knowledge of being able to solve problems. And as tooling for on-call gets more and more sophisticated and allows folks to route the right kinds of alarms to the right people, I think next year, the year following, will be interesting to see potentially how that type of management of on-call might change.
I was surprised by this one, that it's the 2 to 5 people were kind of the on-call team size. And I don't think it takes into account downstream people that get involved in the problem domain, but if you look across our customer base, our larger enterprise customers can have 20, 30 people on call simultaneously. So So I think maybe next year we should ask a little more pointed question about, I know we ask how many people get brought in later in the survey to a problem, but maybe explore this a little deeper because it's a little inconsistent with the data we see.
Additionally, we might need to ask how many different on-call teams they have, because I know for different organizations they have different on-call teams for different disciplines.
Gotcha. Okay, SaaS on-call management tools are starting to take off. So we saw this. This is a big change, I think, from last year, as I recall, where companies we had seen companies that were had built their own internal systems, and they're primarily have historically been older companies that simply had no choice. There was nothing that they could buy. But we're seeing kind of a major change in that this year that I think is also drafting the DevOps thing, where it's like what tools can we either put together, what solutions we can buy that start to handle some of these problems, so we don't have to build them ourselves. It's very common, we found in smaller companies, and I think the data I think it showed this last year in the data, was with smaller companies it tends to be you're very interested in building the solution yourself, especially if there isn't anything available to you. But as the company starts to scale and become larger, what you find is the management of those solutions becomes overwhelming. It's very hard to continue to manage them. And also you tend to miss product enhancements or product features that commercial offerings have, such as reporting, the ability to have built-in retrospective tools, such as the tools we have. And it's really, I think what's happening is the whole space is sort of moving to a solution kind of idea rather than individual tools practices. But the bottom line is people who responded to the survey said, don't build your own, right? Once you go down that path, that's something you just sort of have to unwind later on. And the ability to pull, kind of comprehensive reports is the stuff that allows you to advocate for more people and more systems that you need to do your job. And if you're not enabled with that reporting, those are that puts you certainly at a deficit or a disadvantage.
I think additionally with the bottom line piece, you don't know how much money you're spending on the homegrown. Is it the time of the employees? Is it the different tools you have to order or buy just to keep this homegrown system running?
Right. When you add it all together, are you actually spending more than you would have spent if you'd have just bought something else, used perhaps API hooks to augment it, and do something else.
Plus the opportunity cost loss on not actually building your product.
Yeah, right, for sure. Joni, why don't you talk about monitoring and alerting?
Sure. I mean, there are a proliferation of monitoring and alerting tools in the market. Probably we see like 150 types of tools that people use to monitor their infrastructure. I think some of the changes that we notice, and they're not dramatically represented here in this little word cloud, but the notion that it's not that you're just monitoring your core infrastructure anymore. It's moving up through the APM layer, and then in a lot of cases all the way up through support. So integrating things like Zendesk or Desk or whatever other tool your customers are using to notify you of problems. So what we see still the most common are things like Nagios, Icinga, like a lot of your core infrastructure monitoring tools, but then up through New Relic, which is providing a lot of those APM tools and beyond. And then in terms of being informed of what's going on with your systems, as Todd sort of alluded to in the introduction, it's surprising and sort of unfortunate that email is still the #1 way that people are finding out about issues. I think it's interesting because knowing how many checks these different tools are running and the kinds of information they're spitting out, we're talking about thousands of emails over time that on-call folks are having to dig into to understand the nature of their problems. So I think there's a lot of opportunity that still exists there to help create efficiencies for those folks. But following on with email, the other most common ways people are being informed of issues are things like SMS, push notification, phone calls, and then dashboards that they've built into those different monitoring tools.
One thing I thought was interesting about this, and we talked earlier about the metal versus cloud shift that's happening. Of course, everybody sort of knows that's happening, but I think as that shift happens, what you'll see is in the cloud on this graphic, you'll start to see the infrastructure things like Nagios and Isinga start to drop down in size, because that's really being transferred to a PaaS provider or a cloud service provider as the infrastructure monitor. And as your infrastructure becomes code, you'll see things like the New Relics and the Splunks, perhaps SolarWind and Datadog increase in size, because now debugging is more at the application level and less at the infrastructure level. So this sort of goes with that trend I talked about at the beginning of operations as a pure entity is something that possibly its days are numbered, right? It's something where development is starting to lean into this, and as everything becomes code, so goes operations people. So I think they need to really lean into those kind of things. Alert fatigue is getting worse. So we talked a little bit about this at the beginning. This is the idea that as these monitoring systems start to grow and you become more of them, funneling those through the traditional kind of on-call rotation isn't a great idea, because by definition, as this becomes more complex, the first line of defense, if this is a generic rotation of people on call, actually can't do anything about it. If their first thing if your on-call rotation, if the first thing they do statistically is to reroute this to another person, you probably don't have the best plan set up. Meaning, you need to kind of lean into using, rules engines like we have, or other tools to make sure that the first responder is likely the person that can solve the problem. And that's a driver of what you see a lot with alert fatigue. The more you send the problem to the right person, the less fatigue there is, because you feel like you can solve the problem, right? That's where the anxiety in this job has historically come from. And things you can do, just that help all the time are, have retrospective meetings to address noise through better thresholds, right? So many teams, once the person goes off call, they just kind of, drop the mic and walk out of the room, when it's better if you were to have a meeting about that and really review through reporting sort of which are the nuisance alarms and can you change the thresholds on that. And that's sort of part of number 2 as well, is regularly evaluate and delete superfluous alerts. So, every company, it's like barnacles on your ship, right? It eventually sort of pick up as you go, and if you don't clean house on that, it's a problem. And then, as I mentioned, route incidents to specific people that can do something. Nothing works better than that, and it can be counterintuitive. What we see at our teams that put much wider groups of people on call than the data we saw in previous slides, and because of that, they're able to specifically deal with issues right when they occur, and there's a lot less anxious about it. So it can be counterintuitive. Sometimes the more people that are on call, the easier it is for everyone, and the less specific situations you end up with. And when you do end up in a situation, you can actually do something about it. So, I think very interesting data.
And I think the alert fatigue piece is you're going to hear even more about this in coming years because of the burnouts associated with it. I feel like the people who are on call, if you're suffering from the alert fatigue, it's only going to make your job harder. So you're not going to, I think the burnout happens faster. You're not getting help from your team. It's a situation that doesn't improve. So if you haven't dealt with alert fatigue yet, you should get on that.
Joni, talk to us about the heat of the moment.
Yeah, so tools used during the firefight. We always ask folks to talk a little bit about what tools they rely on when they need to get other people involved and make sure that they're solving problems efficiently. So the number one thing was the synchronous chat and collaboration tools, right? The ability to quickly inform and get other folks up to speed as fast as possible in helping to solve problems is primary. From there, it follows as you can imagine, just any documentation you have. What wiki articles or, remediation documentation and triage documents have been created in your organization that can be leveraged to help folks solve problems. As we talked a little bit about earlier, no one's doing this perfectly yet. And so if you're adding developers or other folks to your on-call rotation, you better make sure that they understand how to find the information they need in order to solve problems. And so that's where some of this tooling really comes into play. So from wikis to graph tools, right? Which internal graphs, either from monitoring systems or other graphs that you've set up, are going to help you diagnose the severity of this issue and making sure that those are at the ready, as well as run books. And then one-to-one phone calls and conference calls have actually sort of moved down the list in terms of frequency of use in the survey as compared to last year. And then when talking about how people communicate externally during an incident, email is still definitely the number one way that people are communicating. But the notion of having a status page is really on the rise. So being able to, post an update to a page that people know to go look at rather than, crafting email templates and subscription lists and all those fun things in order to let folks know what's going on is really a far more efficient and less, developer-intensive way of informing other constituents. From there, it's obviously perhaps to external folks, your website and Twitter sort of round out the ways that people are communicating.
Cool. So I want to talk a little bit, anybody that's been on our site has sort of seen the incident life cycle. That's the way we sort of look at the problem domain, as being something greater than just being alerted to a problem, but really, living with the problem and solving it in real time in a synchronous sort of environment rather than asynchronous. So we use this life cycle graphic a lot in our material, and then so we specifically asked respondents, where they're spending most of their time, and 32% said triage, sort of that first thing you do after that short period when you learn of a problem is to try to figure out what part of the system it's in or what just kind of narrow down on what it is. And 32% said that is the most difficult element in the system, or in sort of this life cycle for them, and it's highly kind of involved in getting others sort of in the loop on it. And I suspect that's why synchronous chat and collaboration tools was number one on the heat of the moment slide, the previous slide, is because usually the more eyes you have on the problem, the faster you can kind of get to that, especially when it's a triage situation where there's a lot of different disciplines involved. It could be, almost anything at that phase of the problem. So the faster you can get through that, sort of the better. 19% said investigation was the most difficult, with sort of where you sort of already know, this is a software problem or this is a network issue or something, but now you're actually trying to figure out what the thing is as being the most difficult thing. Triage can really be shortened too with prior documentation and run books that you can surface within alerts, because often and we've talked a little bit about this, depending on the sort of maturity of the organization. If you aren't doing a really good job with the routing piece right now, often the person who is doing the triage isn't the domain expert. So if you can attach a run book so that you can kind of get them in the right direction really fast, that alleviates that problem a little bit. And so we encourage you to kind of look for those kind of tools also. Tara, why don't you talk about the resolution?
Yeah, so we wanted to find out what people do while they're solving the problem in terms of how many other people are involved and how long does it take. So we asked people, we rephrased the question this year to ask who they get involved after the incident is, while they're trying to solve the incident, who is involved. And as you can see here, the majority of people reported that they work with at least one other person from their team to solve the problem. So that could be working with having a really aggressive notification policy where lots of other people get alerted as well. Only 29% say they are the hero. And I think as we continue on with this survey, we'll see that number actually grows smaller, because I don't think this hero mindset I think it's one that we're moving away from in terms of one person has to be the hero to solve the problem. Additionally, we see here that 42% of respondents said it takes 10 to 30 minutes on average to resolve an incident. And then you can see in that pie chart there's 3% that say it takes more than 3 hours. So we feel sorry for those people.
I think what's sort of interesting about this, there's two things that popped out at me is one, only 13% report working with the NOC. And I kind of expect that number to go down because simply we see our customers at least moving away from a NOC model, right? They just can't be responsive enough. And that's largely because the NOC just doesn't have enough information to help, right? You have to go to the other end of the chain, the people who wrote the software, not the more generic side of the chain, which is the NOC. So that doesn't surprise me, and I expect it to go down. I think it's important to also notice, to kind of add the numbers up, nearly 40%, I think it's 39% of all incidents took longer than 30 minutes to solve. So while there's some good numbers on the low end, there's also a pretty healthy number of incidents that take a long time to solve, and that's where you need to certainly invest your time and effort, I think. Joni, maybe you can talk about this one more.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot already about the ways that information is accessed to solve a problem. So we addressed wikis, runbooks, graphs. But when people are talking about, what is really valuable in helping them solve problems faster, the more cutting edge folks are saying things like DevOps culture, right? If you write the code, you own the alerts. There are people who do really cool things like you push code, you're programmatically on call for the next hour or two, right? Really enforcing this level of responsibility for the code. It's no more, the notion of throwing it over the wall and having somebody else operate your code. Along the lines of also communication, right? Making sure that you have either chat or a conference line available to coordinate those troubleshooting efforts. And then being able to quickly access the right person with the right information that may understand, better how to help you reach resolution.
And not surprising, ChatOps is increasing. We as a company spend a lot of time talking about this and incorporating it into our product, but also we see that in respondents, where 40% reported practicing ChatOps during remediation this year, as opposed to 28% last year. Not surprising. There is a host of tools that are used for this, sometimes in concert together. The list there, I don't believe, is in any specific order, but they are ones that we see often mentioned with customers, or we do integrations with, or whatever. But ChatOps is a real thing, and it's not surprising. It's because it's kind of this melding of the social aspects of problem solving with what actually happened in problem solving. So I think it's very encouraging that we see these kind of numbers. I think what needs to, probably as this area matures, you'll see more things like, capturing all this information, being able to, use it in reporting and things we spend a lot of time thinking about, but I think you'll see the larger market spending time thinking about that also.
Something I thought was interesting about this is going to DevOps Days Enterprise this year, this was the hot topic. So companies like HP and some of your largest organizations are working on instrumenting these practices into their operations challenges, and that blew me away. I was not prepared for that. I thought this was something that small cutting edge organizations who were big on Slack and HipChat were really digging into, but at least the curiosity level, if not adoption, is reaching organizations of all sizes.
I foresee us having a slide next year involving ChatOps best practices.
Yeah, that would be a good thing to add. We'll get Jason to talk to that.
Yeah.
All right, next up, postmortems. More and more, postmortems are one of those words, right? They're kind of used in tandem with retrospectives. It depends on the organization. But regardless of what you call them, it's really important to do them. And I think, only this data suggests that 60% only do them after a significant outage. Do you remember what that number was in last year's? Tara's scrambling. I think it was maybe similar, or maybe...
I think it was a little less.
It was a little less last year, yeah. So I think this is good, because this is a movement definitely within the DevOps area is to like, hey, let's not blame anybody, but for God's sake, let's learn from this problem we just had, because it costs the company time, money, it costs the people, hours of their life. It's an anxious moment in your life. So let's use that data to actually make the system better. And that's sort of this virtuous cycle that we definitely see in our customers, but I think we see in the greater market as well. And 81% of people are trying to make them blameless, which we think is a critical piece to really learning something, so it just doesn't become a finger-pointing exercise. But if you really want to get better, you have to measure it, and you have to do something about it. The majority of postmortems and retrospective results are shared with other stakeholders in the company, which I think is also a really good thing. And frankly, if you look at a kind of a macro trend over IT and certainly in SaaS businesses, but other businesses, historically the software and IT and the infrastructure, that runs the business has been a little backroom compared to how it is today, right? And I think these technical disciplines should embrace being more part of the mainstream company. And I think sharing these retrospectives makes that organization seem much more professional than perhaps it has appeared in the past, because people don't know. What people don't know, what people don't see, they assume isn't there, right? So when you bring structure and reporting and understanding of your area to the rest of the company, I think that actually pays off in dividends to the technical team and things I've talked about before, like being able to advocate new equipment or new people or additional resources. If you bring data, you're always better off with that, and that all kind of starts with doing these kind of retrospective meetings or post-mortem meetings.
The one thing that I think is interesting on the slide is the fact that the majority of people only do postmortems after significant outages, and that being the key phrase there, significant outages. Best practices state that you do a postmortem after every outage, regardless of size. So, that's just something to be taken with you, but, the more you do them, the better you get at them, and the more you learn. So if you just wait for the big outages, you might be losing some information then.
Yep. And finally, kind of the work smarter stuff. There's all kinds of stuff in this area, and I think we've talked about a lot of it during the presentation, but some of my high-level thoughts on this are as I said in the beginning, the changing landscape of how software is written and deployed is an unstoppable force. This is not something that's going to rewind. Every company is going to need to deploy software faster and faster, and the companies that aren't afraid to break things are the ones that are going to succeed. Rather than try to avoid breaking the system, invest in solving the problems quickly, because that keeps you sort of nimble as an organization, and it's essentially the benefit of SaaS as a business. Your business is expecting you to be able to innovate their platform quickly as a strategic advantage, and if you build your systems so that you can do that, you're going to be better off, and you see it in all the large companies that tend to be the innovators. The other macro trend is, that kind of led to all this is, Agile before it and DevOps are unlocking this ability, right? If you're not leaning into DevOps and learning what that's about, if you think DevOps is ops with a dev in front of it, you're probably not, doing the research you need to do, because it's driving almost every trend in this area right now. And I think kind of my parting words on this is, if you run a technical infrastructure in almost any company, regardless of whether it's SaaS or not, you better innovate or you're going to die, right? Speed is of the essence, with where the industry is going in business as it relates to IT, software, and anything technical.
I totally agree, Todd. I also want to just point out this one anecdotal response. Final thoughts about being on call. We asked people just to share any final words they had or thoughts, and the one that really struck me was the one about knowledge sharing. You can't expect everyone on the team to remember how one person fixed any specific problem. It has to be documented, and the documentation has to be accessible and easy to find. I think this strikes the heart of the DevOps movement. It's not just about one person being able to solve a problem. It's not about tribal knowledge. It's about getting everyone on the same page and empowering them with the ability to solve the problems when and if, when the time comes. I think that's a huge thing. As someone who has recently been on call as part of the crisis communication team, I know that when you have the ability to share information with people, it helps the entire organization.
All right. I think, and finally, I think we should just thank our sponsors here, kind of on the last page, DevOps.com, O'Reilly status page, Linux Journal, DevOps Weekly, and Boundary Group, one of our venture funds, was nice enough to help across 5 funds, sent this questionnaire out to many portfolio companies. So that was, super helpful to us as well.
So before we finish, we do actually have one question that came in. So if you're ready for that, Todd.
Hit me.
You mentioned that you see the NOx sort of going away.
Right.
Can you talk a little more about that process, or how you see big companies being able to get rid of the NOx?
Yeah, so we see this in our customer base more and more. So it's a big statement to say NOx are going away, so I don't take that comment lightly. But if you kind of historically look back at what a network operations center did, they sort of did 2 things, right? They rallied a technical team. They triage a problem. So they see a problem come in, and then they kind of compare it against other problems they've seen. And so that's thing one. And historically, that's worked pretty well because innovation rate was pretty low. You didn't change the software systems that often. So they could build up a book of things to do when things happened, and they could sort of be that first line of defense. But as we talked about with, with continuous deployment and Agile, you're now deploying, sometimes hundreds of times a day in a large organization. So what repeated thing is a NOC going to see, right? By definition, you're routing your problems first through a human that can't do anything about it other than dial a phone or find a person. So for that half of what a NOC did, it's really becoming oppressive in an innovative company to use a NOC. So what we see in our customer base are people that are starting to build new services that don't go through the NOC for technical response. Instead, they go directly to the humans that wrote the code, using our software and maybe some other stuff too. So that's thing one. The other thing a NOC does is, rally and notify external contingents about problems, right? This could be business people within the organization. It could be, partners that rely on you, supply chain things in some companies. So, and what we're seeing with that is, that's more likely still the group that's sort of holding on to the NOC, or at least that piece of the NOC. But we also see some companies, and it's one of the reasons we did the integration with status pages, that are sort of replacing a big chunk of that piece of the NOC with something like status page and being more kind of optically transparent with their partners and other constituencies who need to know about technical problems. So when you see these 2 kind of driving trends happening, for a lot of companies, you look at it and scratch your head and go, well, where's the NOC going for those? Some, like a couple pieces of this data I get from very large companies that are engaged with us that use our solution every day, and they're trying to get away from using a NOC. So I think it's a very interesting trend. I think next year we should talk more. We should probably ask more questions about that so we can build up a continuing base of information in this space. But it's super interesting.
Were there any findings or results that were surprising?
I think I mentioned a few kind of in line. I'm trying to think back on what that was. I think it's always interesting to me the infrastructure questions about metal and cloud, because I think if you live in kind of the world we live in, and you go to the AWS show every year as we do, which is a great show, you have a tendency to believe everybody in the world uses cloud right now, and that there's nobody rebooting a server anywhere. But the fact is, the really large companies, while they're being very aggressive, moving things into the cloud, and I found a lot of data to substantiate our numbers, as I said, the Right Scale report, is it still takes a long time. And much like the NOC discussion we had a second ago, is it's more likely that companies of scale are going to put new things in the cloud than to ever move an old thing. So by virtue of that, it's probably a 15-year migration. So you know, the conjecture and the talk is always a little hotter than the reality of it. But that said, that was a pretty substantive move this year across the respondents.
Excellent. Well, we don't have any other questions.
Okay. Well, hey, I really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun. I know that my mimosa glass is empty, so I think the three of us are going to have another toast to the holidays here from the Mountain Base Camp in Colorado, and we'll talk to you next year about all this.
Thank you for those of you who joined us. Additionally, you will get a copy of this report. There is a link to the report under the attachments for this webinar, so you can get the copy yourself and learn more. Thank you.